Okay, well, we're going to let all of that settle for a little bit. And maybe what I'll do is, well, I know, I'll record a top 10 video for my YouTube channel about my top 10 favorite solo board games. I think that's a good idea. So I've been kind of teasing doing this on a couple of comments and such on my YouTube channel, and I'm finally getting around to it. But the truth is, I've been kind of putting it off for a little while. And there's two reasons why. First of all, I have found it very difficult to categorize what I would call my top 10 favorite games. Because while I can certainly say that I like a heavy Euro game over a light gateway game, when you start to get into those actual top 10 favorite games, you realize that there's a lot more than just the game itself that comes into play. You may find yourself asking, well, who am I playing with? What time of day is it? Is tomorrow a work day? Do I have time for all the lengthy setup? Do I really feel like teaching new players? Maybe this is a game that I just kind of like with a specific core group, or a game that I'd rather play on a weekend when I've got all the time in the world, which I really don't even have that. So that's kind of a lot. But anyways, I decided to sort of narrow my field of vision, to apply a couple filters, if you will, to help me to hone in on a specific lineage of games, in this case solo games, that I can speak a lot more confidently about and say that for sure, yes, I like to play this game more than this game in this particular setting with just me as as the only player. The other reason that I've been putting this off is, well, it's something that I'm actually a little more nervous about. You see, I got into making board game related content because I wanted to be a contributor for the Dice Tower Board Game Breakfast, and I accomplished just that. One of the things that they require, though, is that your videos have to be fairly short, about 2 minutes in length. And I think that even you could come up with any topic that you could talk about related to board games for longer than 2 minutes. So in order to work with this requirement, I got into the habit of making very diligent scripts for all of my videos. I write out every joke, every line, everything that I want to say, all of my little nuances, any of my sort of intentional pauses, the changes in scene, changes in camera angles, any of that kind of stuff. And then I even sit down with a timer and I time myself going through each of those changes, each of those scripts, each of those paragraphs, whatever, to try and make sure that I'm going to be within that time limit. What I think that does is make a video that's very concise, it's clean, I think it's professional looking, and I also like to think that it's fairly entertaining. However, it can also make it a little cold. It makes it a little hard to sort of stop and think about what you're saying, and maybe delve a little bit more into a topic and sort of feel yourself engaging a little bit more with your audience. So for the first time in Tabletop Toolbox history, I'm going to do this whole video, including the segment that you're watching right now, without any script whatsoever. I have a list of my top 10 favorite solo games I'm going to talk about, and that's it. So I'm really interested to see in how this is going to go, and I'm anxious to hear your thoughts. Feel free to throw in some comments. If you think I go down a rabbit hole too much in some of these games coming up, certainly let me know. And if you like the format, it's certainly something I will try to keep with, maybe not perchance for the Dice Tower videos, but definitely in my own content that I continue to produce. So with that being said, this is take number 3. I think it's also going pretty good, so maybe we'll roll with this one, and I'm going to move on to the first game on my list. This is number 10. All right, here we go, my number 10 game. This is a theme you're gonna see a bunch, but I did want to start off with something, a little manageable for my first game. So this one's a small box game if you're pulling it out of a shipping container, because this is On Mars by Vital Lacerda. Now, I know what you're probably thinking here. What in the world is On Mars, or any Lacerda game for that matter, doing on a solo games list? And I understand what you're thinking. This game kind of popped on this list almost a little bit by accident. You see, I recently, or a little while ago, did a 4-player game of On Mars. And as with any Lacerda game, it was a complicated game. We had to revisit the rules many times. You're kind of slothing through just everything that game has to offer. And when we were done, it was a fun experience. We all had a good time, but you're sitting there and you're looking back at all the things that you missed, or the little mistakes that you made, or the things that you realized you got wrong, or maybe just didn't take advantage of. And it kind of makes you think, gosh, I wish we could just sit right down and play this game again, now that we understand it a little better. Well, of course, everyone had to go. And so I sat there looking at this table just filled with all the components, everything's still ready to go, and I thought, why don't I try this out solo? And so I did. And I actually really kind of liked it. You know, unlike a lot of Lacerda's other games, there isn't a lot to manage in the solo experience of On Mars. Games like Escape Plan and Kanban, you have multiple AI characters, you have to manage multiple decks of cards, multiple characters you have to move around the board. On Mars isn't quite that bad. There's only one solo bot, there's one deck of cards that kind of helps it go through its actions, there's some interaction points in the spaces that it takes up on the board, and there's a little bit of the flow charting mechanisms that, you know, if this, then you do that kind of a thing. But it's generally pretty easy to manage. The other thing that I like about it is that the game kind of knows, you know, I think Lacerda, whoever made the solo rules, they kind of knew that it really wasn't going to be that tough. So because of that, just having a higher score than the AI isn't really enough to win. The rules actually have a number of sort of tiers that you can reach, and it's more than just beating the AI in score. You have to get certain things done on the board. You have to get your operations center to a certain level. You have to get so many science missions achieved, or certain buildings upgraded, or a certain row of buildings in place. There's other things you have to do than just beat the score. And you can get, you know, obviously you want to try and get as many of those as you can to sort of reach those higher levels of victory. But, you know, I don't typically like games that just say, okay, well, this score wins, but this score really wins, and this score wins the most, because I feel like those games know that they're swingy and they're just very luck-based. But this is more than just different tiers of score. It's tiers of score, but also getting certain conditions met during the gameplay. And I think that just creates a better challenge to you, the player. Okay, yeah, I gotta beat the bot, but I have to do more than just that. So you're looking at all the different avenues of strategy. You know, a lot of his games use trigger points. You go here, and that may trigger something else, and that may trigger something else. And so using those to your advantage is how you're going to reach those higher tiers of victory in the solo game of On Mars. That's what I think of this one. I also want to take a quick moment, and I want to mention my number 11 game. Now, I did this review by using a website called Pub Meeple, and I'll put the link here. Pub Meeple, you can link it to your BGG account, you can give it your list of games, and it'll kind of help you pick, okay, I like this one more than that one. It's very straightforward, very easy to use. This game, on my last pass through my roster, this game got compared against Nemo's War, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of, as I've lent it out to a local gamer. Nemo's War is a big box solo only game. Yes, there's some multiplayer rules, but I've heard that they're not even really worth playing. When these two games came up on the screen, I really sat there and I looked at them and I really had to think about it. Now, Nemo's War is this big, sprawling solo game. Like On Mars, it takes up a tremendous amount of table presence. There's a ton of rules to get through. Nemo's War is more of a story-based game. You got this deck of cards that you kind of assemble at the beginning of the game, and it can be very random from one play to the next. And that's really great, because every time you play it, it can be a different experience. You can also kind of tailor your experience at the beginning of the game. Are you going to go for exploration? Are you going to go for combat? Are you going to go for building insurrection? There's a whole lot you can kind of customize into that game, and that's great. But unlike On Mars, it is a dice-chucking luck fest. Everything you do in that game is a roll of the dice. Even if you're just trying to fix up your ship a little bit or let your crew rest up and regain some health, you can still have bad luck in just trying to do that. And when those two games came up on the screen, that's why I ultimately clicked on this one over Nemo's War, because this game is about strategy. It's about picking the path through the actions and just trying to do the right things in the right order. Nemo's War, you can have the best intentions, you can go after all the right goals, and you can just roll duds on every time, and that's just how that game is going to shake out. So very, very different games, very, very different experiences, and it really comes down to what you like in a game. Do you want something that can be kind of swingy? Because that's exactly how that game scores. It's, well, if you get this score, you kind of won, but if you get this score, then you super won. And I just don't really care for that in a solo experience, because, okay, well, I won, but I got the low score. So what did I really accomplish, right? Anyways, that's my number 10, On Mars, and my number 11, Nemo's War. And now let's move on to number 9. My number 9 game is a little bit of a departure from the previous two, actually, that I just spoke about. This is a city building game with worker placement and engine building mechanisms with a beautiful woodsy theme. This is, of course, Everdell by Starling Games, which I think lives kind of right about here in my collection, if I recall. Everdell is a beautiful game with an amazing table presence in which you are building a city of structures, inviting little critters out in the forest against other players. Now, I've certainly seen some comments from folks who just Everdell didn't click with them. There are some folks who have had problems getting the engine building mechanisms to really work for them, and they've struggled to get some decent scores. And I can certainly understand that. I've had a couple dud games myself. To those folks, I'd recommend, if you want to give the game another go, come to understand the value of simply having a handful of cards. There's a lot of spaces on the board, there's a lot of cards you can get into play, and even the Spirecrest expansion really kind of forces you to do a lot more just by having cards. You can trade them in for resources, for other cards, or for points at the end of the game, and Spirecrest can even force you to have to pay additional cards as sort of a penalty, if you will, when you're trying to get something out in your city. So come to understand just how beneficial it is to have a handful of cards as much as you possibly can, and you may get the game to work out a little better for you. On the solo front, Everdell is a very fast and efficient game. Anytime that you place a card into your city, you roll a d8 die, those numbers correspond to a space in the meadow, and the AI obtains that card. At the end of the game, they score based on simply the colors of the cards that they've had. They also have a little bit of a flowchart mechanism in that if they have all the cards that they need to get an event, they claim that event automatically. And any events that you don't get throughout the game, they get the score at the end of the game. So you do have to kind of watch out for that little point bump at the game's end. So I really like how fast the game plays. If you put a worker down, you grab a couple resources, you immediately go again. The AI doesn't even do anything. I also really like the fact that Everdell has rules for solo play in all of its expansions. So if you want some huge grand experience using all the different components of Everdell, you can certainly do that. Now, I haven't done it myself because the setup and teardown time is pretty extreme in that version of a game, but you can certainly do so if you're up for it. I will also say that if you don't have Everdell, I don't know that I'd recommend getting it just for the solo play. There are some elements of the multiplayer game that just don't come through in the solo game. For example, you could have certain cards out that kind of gives you a store that other players can visit throughout the game, giving you some extra points. There's no element of that at all in the solo game, and it's kind of a letdown. It's not a major component that you'll find lacking, but there's just something about having all these different cities sitting around the main board that you'll definitely miss out in the solo game. However, it's very fast to play. I think that if you're just using the base game, you can probably set up, play, and tear down in maybe 30 minutes flat. So it's really an excellent solo game, and if you have it and are just bummed that you don't get it to the table more often, or if you just haven't tried it, I really recommend giving it a go. That's my number 9, Everdell. Let's check out number 8. All right, my number 8 is back to a theme that I did say you would probably see fairly often in this video, but this time it is actually a small box game. This is Deep Space D6, designed by Tony Go. Now, this is a solo-only experience. It's a pretty straightforward game. You've got a deck of cards that will represent some threats or enemy ships or whatever it may be, and you're in a spaceship of your own, rolling dice to represent which crew members are basically going to show up to work that day. You will then assign those crew members as you see fit to try and deal with any of the threats that you're currently facing. Fairly straightforward. You get some chances to re-roll, kind of like a Yahtzee sort of a thing, and again, you're just plucking those dice on those threats. Now, what makes the game kind of interesting and maybe a little challenging is when those threats stack up in a certain way where they may nullify various results of the die. So I've had instances where you can't use your captains until your engineers fix a problem, but then you've got some sort of an issue and all of your engineers are tied up in sick bay for whatever reason, and you just cannot get anything done, and it is a very rapid death of your spaceship. But it's, those instances can happen, but it's somewhat rare, and you just kind of have to recognize when those things start to stack up what you have to deal with in what order. There's also an expansion for the game that I really like because it introduces super weapons, and those are an extra set of cards that you can build in a particular order. You have to build each super weapon in a particular order, assigning crew members to it kind of one at a time. and you can build up those weapons, and they do make the game very overpowered for you. You then become this just juggernaut of a ship, and I really do like that mechanism in these games. I like a game where, you know, maybe take a little while to get there. It's a little bit of a challenge. Obviously, you're spending resources to build a weapon instead of dealing with your other threats. But once you get that done, you can just decimate all of your foes, and I enjoy playing that way. Straightforward game, maybe a little hard to find. He does reprints kind of when he can. But it's a very fun game. Deep Space D6, my number 8. Now, let's check out number 7. Let's stay amongst the stars for just one more round, shall we? Because my number 7 is a space-based combat action adventure game. This is Warp's Edge by Renegade Games. It's an entry in their Solo Hero series, which I did have to look up, and spoiler alert, there's only 2 titles in that series. Hopefully they'll get some more added soon. Warp's Edge is a bag building game which will have you as a solo combatant against an enemy mothership and its fleet of minions. Now you play across multiple rounds, or warps as they're called in the game, and you run out of tokens to trigger the next warp. At the beginning of each warp, all of the enemy minions come back into play. Some of the enemy ships might be protected, which means you can't attack them until all the minions are out of the way, and that may require you to really beef up your bag before you'll have enough firepower to take out all the minions and still have some shots left to go up against the mothership. Now, of course, you start off with a couple default tokens. These tokens may let you shoot at your enemies, dodge enemy fire, or charge up your ship to buy additional tokens. There's also some power tokens, and these differ based on which ship you're taking into combat. These can let you spread attacks across multiple opponents, charge up weapons for special effects, and there's some other features in there as well. The variability of the game definitely comes in as far as the ships that you take into combat and the motherships that you go up against. Some of them can be pretty difficult, like those protected ones. There are others that are a little easier to get around, and of course, depending on which ship you take into battle can really help you out as well once you come to really understand the effects of those power tokens. But the game's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot to it. There's a lot of decision making that you've got despite the luck elements of the bag, and it's a pretty straightforward, simple game that can definitely give you a little bit of a challenge. So that is Warp's Edge, my number 7. Let's check out number 6. All right, for number 6, it is time to leave space behind and maybe go somewhere a little more dangerous. This is one of my all-time favorite games. This is Dinogenics by Ninth Haven Games. This is a worker placement game where you are trying to acquire DNA sequences to get dinosaurs into your park safely into pens for the amusement of your visitors. And also for the amusement of those visitors, you are trying to get amusement aspects in place in your park as well, be it hotels or cafes or animatronic rides or just statues. And that is on the surface alone a very beautiful and just challenging game. However, it also has some of those seedy underbelly elements that made the Jurassic Park movies what they are. So there's a deck of asset cards, and these things may give you access to the black market. You could possibly steal DNA. You can do, some counter-espionage units. You can hire some questionable workers to build buildings at a discount. There's a lot you can do that sort of takes you underground a little bit in the thematic elements of this game, and it is just fantastic. Now, in the solo game, there are a number of scenarios that you can play. They will give you starting conditions that you may have to try and deal with. You may have a couple of dinosaurs, but no fences, or you may just not have any money to start with, and you've got to work your way through those puzzles. They usually give you a certain number of turns to acquire a certain number of points. And I'll tell you, they're fairly difficult. In fact, I don't think I've beaten any of them, but it is a fantastic way to just get this game to the table and play it. Is it worth it just for the solo experience? That may have to be up to you. I think I have played it solo about as many times as I've played it multiplayer, and I just love seeing it on the table that it is worth it for me. This is my number 6, Dinogenics. Let's check out number 5. All right, but enough with the dinosaurs and the wild beasts. It's time to get back to space, and this time I'm going to do so boldly because my number 5 is Star Trek Frontiers. Now, let's get this out of the way, all right? I grew up with my family watching Star Trek The Next Generation. I've probably seen every episode that was ever made. I didn't see any Star Wars until I was in high school, and if I'm honest with you, it just never really clicked with me. Now, you may not be very happy with that answer, and you're welcome to let me know, but don't make me set my phasers to stun. Star Trek Frontiers is a reskinning of the classic game Mage Knight. This is a big, sprawling adventure game. In this game, you kind of build a universe from a triangle, from kind of starting from one point. You've got planets to visit, encounters to deal with, enemy ships to deal with, and maybe even the Borg will show up. It's definitely a lot in a single box, and the rules will point that out to you very clearly. The walkthrough guide to get started is 24 pages, or 20 pages. The main rulebook is 24 pages, and I think this is size 9 font in here too. But this is a deck building game, so you start off with a core set of cards based on whichever ship you choose, and you get to pick a couple of extra decks to kind of work into the overall structure of your decks. Hey folks, Future Jeff here. Never mind. Anyways, I couldn't let this go to air without fixing a little mistake that I made here. You see, there isn't a deck construction element to Star Trek Frontiers. Instead, you start off with a basic set of cards relevant to the ship that you're taking into the game. And they're pretty much all the same, except for the one that represents your captain. But throughout the game, there will be a series of decks that sit on the table, and these are ones that you feed into your deck throughout the game. You've got undiscovered cards, regular and elite crew members, and some advanced action cards. So with that set straight, let's get back to what he has to say. You get to level up your captain as you play. This can unlock additional skills that will help you out throughout the game, and you can also increase your deck size, which just gives you more options to play with. The beginning of the game, in my experience, can be a little slow, but there's just a ton of variety, a ton of options, and that's what I think makes it feel like such a complex game with so many rules that you need to slog through to get started. But it's a fantastic experience. And I'll say this too, as far as a couple Star Trek games go, Star Trek Fleet Captains is a great game, often described as Star Trek in a box, but it doesn't really work solo. It's pretty much a minimum 2-player game. In fact, I think it's only pretty much a 2-player game. There's some elements for, I think, 3-player in teams, but it just doesn't really work that well. Also, there's Star Trek Ascendancy, which unfortunately I don't own. I've heard that you can play with it solo if you get the Borg expansion, but I've also heard that it is incredibly difficult, and it kind of makes you feel like you're not actually playing Star Trek, from what I've been told. I can't weigh in here. I don't have it. But if you're looking for a wonderful solo experience to put you in the universe of Star Trek Frontiers is the way to go. That's my number 5. Let's check out number 4. For number 4, we stay in space, but we will return to the 20th century because this is Leaving Earth, a very curiously packaged and published game from a small independent arts and craft company out in California called the Luminaris Group. Leaving Earth, I think, sort of redefines everything that I thought about how a game can and should be played. For starters, there's no board. Instead, you have a series of cards that you arrange on the table to sort of recreate our solar system. You also play as a number of space agencies that existed back in the 1950s, and you're playing through the 20-year Great Space Race from that era in time. Other cards will give you various technologies that you will use either to build your rockets or to use these rockets. And they're not just the components, they're also certain things that you would do with a rocket, such as surveying, landing, rendezvousing with components in space, life support, and more. There's also cards that represent the various components of a shuttle, from the rockets themselves to the capsules. You can hire astronauts, you have to give them supplies to live out in space, and more. You've also got mission cards that you randomly draw from at the beginning of the game, and these are basically giving you the challenges that you're trying to face in the game itself. The solo game simply works in that you're trying to get as many points as you can so that you've earned more points by the end of the game than the points of the missions that you haven't earned. It's basically that straightforward. There is no actual AI that you play against. What makes this game so unique, though, is that when you're moving from card to card in our solar system, there are maneuvers, there are difficulties for each of those maneuvers, and you have to make sure that you have enough thrust to move the mass of your rocket through those maneuvers. Now, the rulebook does a fantastic job of laying this out for you, but you basically can't play this game without some sort of a spreadsheet or chart or something to track your maneuvers. And even more so, you have to do so in reverse. You have to make sure that the last component that you're moving back to Earth, you have enough thrust to do that. You then have to add those components, those thrusters, and compensate it for the previous maneuver, and so on and so forth. So again, there's a lot of math and a lot of planning that you have to do in this game. I think that's what makes it so good for solo play, in that you don't have to sit and wait for another opponent, another player to go through all those gyrations and all that math on their turn. However, because of that complex setup and just the fact that you need something on the side, something that's literally not going to fit in this box, to go through all that math is why this isn't quite as high on my list. However, Leaving Earth is a phenomenal experience I love the fact that when you're done playing, you really feel like you have a story to tell. You should have just seen this mission. You should have seen what I was able to pull off and get this game won on the final year. It was amazing. Check it out. So this is Leaving Earth, my number 4. Let's come back to Earth for number 3. All right, listen up. I'll give you a little reprieve from the space games, but don't expect it to last very long. Listen, I just love space games. I'm not afraid to admit it. But let's go somewhere different, shall we? Like, how about Bavaria, Germany? In fact, how about we visit my number 3 favorite title? This is Hallertau, which as of this printing is the latest big box farming game from legendary designer Uwe Rosenberg. This is also the first game on this list for which I've already made a review of here on my YouTube channel, so you're welcome to go and check that out. And because of that, I'm not going to delve super deep into the mechanisms or gameplay of this title. But basically, Hallertau is a worker placement game that will have you putting workers out onto an action board and using those actions to try and get as many resources from your little village as you can. You'll use those resources to upgrade some buildings in the village, and if you can get those buildings upgraded far enough, you can then upgrade the community center. Doing so gives you more workers in subsequent rounds and more points for the end of the game. Get 100 points and you win. Get 110 and you won very well, I guess. What I love so much about Hallertau, and I talked about it in my review and also on the quick clip that I had out on the Dice Tower Board Game Breakfast, this game is just very chill. It's very relaxing. And the solo game especially is very neat because there is no AI element to work with at all. There's no workers you have to place for the opponent. There's no action you have to worry about taking for the opponent. There's basically nothing that steps on your feet. What that means is that each round is your turn, and you can spend your workers in whatever order you want to try and maximize your profits from everything that you've got going in your village. So for example, if you want to harvest some wool from your sheep, but you also want to get more sheep, then obviously you want to try and get the sheep first so then you can harvest and get more wool from the additional sheep. You don't have to worry about losing that action to an AI player. That's really neat. The only difference is, and it's really not, again, it's not a difference, it's the mechanism of the game. You flip a card at the beginning of each round and it shows you a quadrant that you take some workers off of, which will free up some actions and make actions cheaper for your subsequent rounds, but it may not free up the actions that you want. So you still have to be strategic to try and make sure that you have enough resources to upgrade your village and get to the points that you need to win the game. But it's just generally, it's very relaxing. You can, like I said, you can pick your path and then put your plan into action, and it's a lot of fun. I will say this, however, there's a couple different decks that you use throughout the game. One that lets you get some additional resources. There's another deck that lets you build production. There's another deck that lets you get end game scoring. And there are different decks that you can use for each playthrough of the game. Each deck kind of focuses on a particular resource, at least according to the rule book. In my experience, I haven't really noticed a tremendous amount of difference between those decks. Also, you're not going to get that many cards of each deck throughout a single game. So you could probably play with the same deck a couple times and still have a variety of cards that you haven't seen from one gameplay to the next. So I kind of feel like after a handful of plays of this game, I may have kind of seen just about everything that it has to offer, and it kind of starts to get a little repetitive and, okay, I've been there, I've done that. So definitely take that into account when you're looking to purchase the game, especially if you're only looking for solo play. Now, listen, it's Hallertau, Germany. It's Hallertau hops, one of the noble hops used in beer production. So when I saw this game come out, there was basically no doubt that I was going to get it. And when I saw that it had a solo mode, again, it was kind of a no-brainer. So take that into account going forward for sure. That's my number 3. Now let's get to number 2. All right, this is game number 2, and Monty Python said it best when he said, now it's time for something completely different. We spent a lot of time in space. We did just leave Hallertau, Germany. Let's go to, I don't know, Victorian England? Sure, why not? Because this is Obsession by Dan Halligan. Now, I've done a couple videos of Obsession here on my YouTube channel. The basic story was my friends introduced me to it. I had no interest in it. We played it anyways. I didn't like it at all, but I kept thinking about the mechanisms of this game. You've got deck building, you've got worker placement, you've got this kind of tableau city building, or in this case, estate building with a builder's market. You're trying to slot upgrades into your estate. And then you kind of have this kind of party planning aspect where you're trying to throw these events to attract the right people. And it really just comes together very well. It is a very, very fun game. Now, the problem I have with Obsession is the multiplayer game. It just can really drag. You can run into some AP situations in the game. Maybe a move that you were going to make ends up just not working out, or you kind of forgot something. Maybe your family is not up to the level you need to be to host a certain event or invite a certain person, or maybe you used a worker that you kind of forgot you had used. And so you can really kind of sit there and devise your strategy. You got to change your plans kind of a lot throughout the game. And so it just makes the game slow down a lot, especially start getting up to 3-4 players. The solo game gets rid of all of that. You take a turn, you roll a die for the AI, it plucks a upgrade off of the builder's market, and you go right into your next turn. There's a deck of cards that gives you a variety of opponents that you can play against. So you don't have that whole thing of, well, you score this amount to do well, or this amount to do very well, or this amount to do super great. You just pick a card, easy, medium, hard, also short or long game variants, and you play against that one opponent. You beat its score, you win the game. It's that simple. And I really like that. There's also a solo estate challenge. There's actually 2 modes of solo play, but you do need the upstairs, downstairs expansion to get that extra mode. And that gets rid of this kind of courtship round where you're trying to attract the love interest, if you will, of this other family. And it just focuses on building the best estate and getting your family's ranking up as high as you can get it. So I just love the amount of variety in this box. And for all the multiplayer games I've talked about that have solo variants, this is probably the one that I would recommend getting for the solo experience alone. It really streamlines the process. It gives you the same experience. It gives you the exact same experience as playing multiplayer, but just in the solo game, but it's much faster, and you do still kind of feel like you had to work against this opponent to win. And I really, really like the way that it works out. This is Obsession, my number 2, and now it's time for number 1. All right, folks, here we are. My number 1 favorite solo board game. Now, I'm sure at this point you're pretty much expecting that we're heading back to space. And honestly, who am I to disappoint you? But you might be surprised to learn just how new this game is to my collection. In fact, it only came in about a month ago. Now, luckily, I've had a couple opportunities to play this both solo and multiplayer. And those were all really good experiences. But this game is so new, it's not even out yet at retail. This was a Kickstarter game. This is Rocket Men by Martin Wallace and published by Phalanx. Now, since this game is so new, let me try and give you a quick rundown. This is a deck building game that has 1 to 4 players working as nondescript space agencies, trying to launch missions to a number of locations in our solar system. You've got either the orbit of Earth, the Moon, or Mars, and there's 4 different missions you can attempt at each of those locations. Now, the cards in the game let you do a couple things. First, they'll represent the missions themselves. You'll slot one into your command center, and that sort of dictates where you're trying to go. They also represent money, which you'll use to purchase upgrades for your space agency. You'll also purchase the ability to put those cards on your launch pad. So once you obtain them, they go through your deck. You can now put them out in the launch pad. Lastly, a lot of these cards will give you special abilities, icons, or even benefits to your launches to help you be more successful. Now, how does that work? On the side of the board, there's a track that runs from the surface of Earth all the way up to Mars with the moon on the way. When you're attempting a launch, you'll check the cards on your launch pad to see how far up that track you start. From there, you turn to the mission success deck. This is a separate deck of cards with numbers on it ranging from 0 to 4. The mission that you're attempting will tell you how many of these you can flip over, adding the values to your spot on the track. And if by the time you flip over the last card, you've reached your destination, then you are successful. You gain a couple of points, you get a permanent upgrade to your space agency, and you pretty much clear your launch pad and get ready for the next mission. Now, how does the solo mode work? So the AI has a separate token that sits on that same track, but it moves slowly up that track on every one of your turns. The AI doesn't really have its own turn, it just activates on your turn. If it's on the track, it'll move one location at the start of your turn towards its destination. And if it reaches that destination in that movement, it scores its points and then takes the token off the track. On your next turn, if the token's not on the track, you flip over 2 cards. One tells you where the AI is heading, and the other one tells you which mission it's attempting. And between the 2 cards, you'll glean the starting value for where that token is going to start on the track. You simply place it on the track of that location and proceed with your turn. Now, in addition to this, you've got the storefront of cards on the board. If you don't purchase any cards during your turn, then the left card is discarded, everything moves 1 space to the left, and a new card comes out on the right. When that store is completely empty, the game is over. So it's a built-in timer. Now, here's one thing to note. The AI will always move at its same pace as it approaches a mission. It always moves one space on your turn. It's also starting off with an active mission and it's already on its way there, which means the AI will get out ahead of you early in the game and you'll spend most of the game trying to catch up. But the real challenge is in trying to balance how you're spending your money. Yes, you're trying to get cards into your deck, but on the same token, you've got to get those cards on a launch pad and you have to get missions in progress because that timer will run out very quickly. And like I said, you'll spend the entire game trying to chase down the AI. So it's a very stressful, very involved, very challenging strategic solo game. Now, I want to take a moment to compare this to Leaving Earth, which I mentioned just a couple numbers ago. I think Leaving Earth is a more grand experience. When you get done a game of that, you really feel like you have a story to tell. But as I mentioned, it's got a fairly lengthy setup and also pretty much cannot be played without some sort of a spreadsheet or a chart or even a laptop running a spreadsheet on the side to help you plan out your missions. You simply cannot do it all in your head. Compared to that, Rocketmen is much more streamlined. It's a little more bare bones. There's not as many places that you can go to, but I feel like that added tension is a really enticing feature in this game. You see, in Leaving Earth, you can get yourself to a point where a mission is 100% guaranteed success. You can't really do that very well in Rocketmen. I mean, you could, but you get to a point, it would take you so long to get to that point, I should say, that you're never going to be able to catch up to the AI. So you have to be a lot more balanced in your approach. In Leaving Earth, you can kind of sit back and let your money work for you, get everything researched up, and then just bang out your missions very easily. Anyways, I think Rocketmen is just a phenomenal experience. It's a very beautiful presence on the table too, especially if you get the upgraded game mats. This game looks fantastic. It plays very, very well, and it's just a lot of stressful fun. And that's why Rocketmen is my number one. All right, folks, well, that's it. My top 10 favorite solo board games and the first video on my channel without any script whatsoever. Now, this did take me a good bit longer to put together than I thought it would. I had to reshoot a number of videos, including this one, due to some equipment problems along the way, believe it or not. But I did learn a lot along the way, and I do hope that you enjoyed the experience. If you have any constructive criticism, I'm certainly all ears. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this list of games. I hope you'll seek a couple out on your own, and if you do, then I really hope you enjoy your playthroughs as much as I have. That's it for me though. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks a lot for watching. Cheers.